Nap after that lovely food. But stay awake. All right, we have a couple quick announcements. The Unconference got some great ideas. Thank you very much. We've culled them down to 3, and they are as follows. If you're interested in this, we'll also be putting it on the updated schedule so you can go online and see it that way too. First off, at 3:20, yet another option during the 3:20 slot is going to be making money with merchandise and other products. Jay will be helping get the conversation going, but again, the point of unconference sessions is that everyone talk and we don't really have them planned out, so he'll literally just start the conversation and then I want all of you to kind of take it forward. Then at 4:15, we're going to be doing seed funding because there were a lot of people who asked about that. And Steve will be helping with that, wherever Steve just went. Thank you. And then finally, we wanted a chance for people to talk about Facebook. I know people had some thoughts, especially after the presentation yesterday, and there's a lot of discussion going on, so we want people to have a place to do that. So we're calling that Facebook Feedback, and that will be at 5:15. All 3 sessions will meet here in the south part, just outside here of the auditorium where all those open tables are. So again, at 3:20, we'll do making money with merchandise and other products. At 4:15, we'll be doing seed funding. And then at 5:15, we'll be doing Facebook Feedback, and Doug will help get that conversation going. All right? Great. And then I'd like to turn it over to Bigger Media. Stephen has just a few thoughts and comments. And thank you for helping sponsor this conference.
I guess it's good afternoon now. I'm Steve. This is also Steve. We are in from Nashville, Bigger Media, and it's my 3rd year here at Lion. Our 2nd year as a sponsor. We're very pleased to be able to do that, and excited to share with you something new that's happening for us since last year when we were here. Steve founded a company called Wanna Do, and it's really added a 3rd dimension to everything we're doing in Nashville around news, sports, and now things to do. And it's the first of what we hope are going to be several initiatives that we bring out to the community of independent publishers around the country, around the world, that provide tools and solutions that help you save time, make more money, and all the things that I constantly hear everybody is trying to do here at Lion. So with that, I want to hand it over to Steve, and I hope you'll welcome him. It's his first time here.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you guys for allowing me to participate. I do identify with being a local online business. While I started out 6 years ago to build a platform and a technology to support things to do, curation in different cities, I've also developed Wanna Do Nashville, which is a brand that I found is not always easy to monetize and to scale. And one of the reasons I've been so pleased to work with Bigger Media is to figure out some of that revenue generation strategy and begin to become profitable. But what we're here to talk to you just briefly about today is how Wanna Do as a platform can power automated things to do content on your site. I'm just going to run through a couple quick slides. But we all know that we're getting requests every day to please post my event, and we all know what a pain it is to submit those events and to get them uploaded into your system, right? It's timely, it's a pain. And for that reason, most local online publications aren't doing a very good job. It just takes too much time, and there's too many events. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of events each month, and nobody's got time for that. Well, what we're offering is a completely automated, completely customizable things to do solution that allows you to meet your audience goals and your revenue goals in that context of events and activities. This is something that we work with you to plug in, to turn on. It's sort of a set and forget, although we hope you won't forget that it's there. But you don't have to worry about publishing on a day-to-day basis. What you'll find when someone submits an event, if you do have them submit an event, 9 times out of 10, you can ask them, just check to see if it's there, because it'll already be on your site wherever you want it to be. Customize, well, we've been working now on several sites in Middle Tennessee to make sure that each site has exactly the format and the style and the placement of different kinds of events. The feeds are all customized depending on your audience goals. And we're also developing our various models and even coming up with things like pricing sheets and strategies that we found are ready ways to monetize your Things to Do section once you have a robust calendar on your site. So that's what we're all about. We'd love to talk to you guys further. Anyone who has an interest in being the best at things to do in your city in a way where you can make money right away, not spend more money, but make more money, come and talk to me or Stephen Ludwig. Thanks so much.
And so our first, what we're calling a quick talk, which is going to be a little bit longer than one of the lightning talks, but still a somewhat brief presentation and then Q&A session, is going to be Mary Walter Brown from the News Revenue Hub speaking on membership.
Hello, everyone. Really glad that you got to have lunch before I spoke. So yeah, I'm from the News Revenue Hub. We provide the back-end technology and the front-end strategies to help news organizations, large and small, monetize their audience through membership. I came from Voice of San Diego. I was the publisher there for 6 years. So I know what it's like to run a small news organization and have a staff, very small staff that's forced to wear a lot of hats. But at Voice of San Diego, we started in 2005, and we really believed as part of our mission, and really one of the distinguishing things about how we wanted to operate as an organization, was that we believe the audience and the people in the community should help support the service that we provided. And so we were from the very beginning, very open with our audience about the need for them to support us. So when I came on board in 2011, the audience was already pretty well conditioned to understand that we were a nonprofit, but they didn't really quite understand what their role was and why we needed their support. And so what I began to institute was this ongoing conversation with our audience about who Voice of San Diego was, why we were a nonprofit, what our mission is. And what we quickly found was people did not understand what our business model was. We had done a good job of telling other people's story, but we had never really taken the time to craft or share our own story. And so as a result, people didn't really understand what it was that we needed from them. So we created a membership program, and we devised some back-end tools to help automate a lot of those conversations, because as we all know, we're well-intentioned. We like to start campaigns and talk to our audience, but the minute a story breaks, or the minute we have to prepare for our board meeting or a budget meeting, all of those things go on the back burner. And so one thing we really learned about marketing and fundraising is it has to be consistent and has to be happening all the time in the background. So when we were able to really automate a lot of those conversations, that's when we really saw a transformation and a revenue stream spring up that could be predictable and ongoing. And as that happened and as we began to succeed, we started getting a lot of calls from other news organizations who wanted us to help them replicate our systems and our successes. And so we saw the opportunity to create another organization that was really fully focused on helping news organizations build membership programs. And so we spun off this past year, and became a standalone. We're being fiscally sponsored by the Institute for Nonprofit News right now. And the majority of our funding is coming from foundation support. And we now have 16 news organizations that we're working with across the country. And these are some of the orgs that we're working with, or all of them. And as you'll see, we really wanted to pick, for this kind of a 2-year pilot, a really diverse group of news organizations. We wanted hyperlocal, regional, topicals, and even some bigger national, more legacy news organizations. And we have for-profits and we have nonprofits. So we've really learned a lot over the past year. And many of the things that we've learned are actually very positive. The first thing I want to share is that we've surpassed our expectations in our ability to help these organizations raise money. Within the first year, we've been able to raise over $2.5 million for them, and we're doing it in 2 different ways. We're really pushing ongoing monthly recurring donations. So the money that's in the bank right now collectively is 1.5, but I think what's even more encouraging is that the predictable revenue that's being pledged over the next year and beyond is nearly $1 million. So for many of these organizations, they have something that they've never had before, the ability to predict their revenue out into the future and to be able to make long-term business decisions based on the money they know is coming in next April or May. They know they might be able to hire a reporter then or launch a project then. So that's what I really want to convey, is the importance of really having a new predictable revenue stream that you can depend on, and that you can influence and you can ramp up. The other thing that we're really focused on greatly is constantly building the pool of potential members. Our strategy is very email focused. If you've heard me speak before, I sound like a broken record in that the key to all of this is building your email list, because that's where the personal conversations take place. That's where you're converting people from a casual reader to a full-fledged financial supporter and a real loyalist. So you have to be obsessed with building that email list. And so that's another thing that we work with our organizations on, is really focusing on compelling lead acquisition features on your site, or creating really strong newsletter products that you can then market to them and build your email list. So we've been helping them by increasing their pool of potential donors by 27%. And this is meaningful regardless of the size. I know some of you are small organizations, and we work with small organizations. So one of our smallest orgs has $88,000 in the bank and another $34,000 pledged. So that was a big transformation from where they were before. They have money in the bank, but they also know that more money is coming in. And our largest is closer to $400,000 in the bank and another $400 pledged. So it's not just the big orgs that can be successful. Your success is relevant to your operation size. So you just really have to start having those conversations with your audience. So I just wanted to share a little bit about some of the key learnings. We're almost a year into this, so we're trying to kind of step back and reflect on what's working so we can share that with you. People will support journalism. They will, and that's across the board, 16 different markets, if they trust and value the content you're producing. So if you're worried about having a conversation and you're worried that no one will support you, if you're confident that the work you're producing is good, solid journalism, rest assured people will support it if you ask them. But you have to help them understand why the support is needed. You know, we are journalists, we are critical thinkers, and so is our audience. So we have to be transparent enough to say, this is our business model. This is what percentage of our business model we need you to help us fund. Maybe it's 40%, maybe it's 50%. But whatever it is, be honest and open with them and unapologetic about the fact that we've opted to keep this content free and open to the public, but it's not free to produce, and we need your help. And you have to make it easy for them to support it. It has to be a frictionless donation process. There has to be a donation button on your site that's easy to find. You can't make them fill out 5 or 6 different fields: first name, last name, email address, credit card, and boom. It really has to be simple. And constant and consistent communication is key. We are all about automating emails. MailChimp, Constant Contact both allow you to do autoresponders. I really encourage you to set up autoresponders. The minute someone subscribes to a newsletter, registers to comment on your site, registers to come to one of your events, that should trigger the beginning of an autoresponder. Even a bare bones one out of Constant Contact is better than nothing at all. So I would encourage you to set up a 1 or 2 autoresponders that begin to introduce the reader to your site, to some of the people who work there, to the editor, the publisher, some of your key reporters. It's really about building a personal relationship, and we've seen this work. But I also think it needs to have an ongoing basis. It has to happen over and over. And then what we do that we found incredibly effective, which I think each and every one of you could do right now, is commit to sending out one, what we call timely topical pitch per month. That's one where you pick maybe your top story of the month, and you remind them about why it's so relevant, why it's so important, some of the impact that it's made in the community. It's a really important ongoing exercise in helping the reader understand that this isn't just news, that this is important public service information that brings about change in your community. This is a thing you can put on your calendar and just remind yourself to do once a month, and little by little it will help connect the dots with your readers. The other thing is, once they are giving, retention is just as important as recruitment. We begin reminding people that it's time to give again 90 days prior to their expiration date. So really trying to hardwire into your systems reminders. If it's not automated, if you don't have that ability, another thing on your calendar just to remind people, run a report in whatever database you're using, even if it's an Excel spreadsheet, each month and see who's due to give again, and just make that a part of your business practice. This is just an example of what we call a timely topical pitch. As we know, the news cycle is crazy right now. If there's something big that's happening, John Oliver went on quite a rant about journalism and why it was so important last year. We took that opportunity and turned it into a timely topical pitch, sent it out to our clients and said, customize it to your audience, shoot it out today. Many of them raised $5,000 in a couple of hours just by reminding people, linking to the YouTube video and saying, yeah, this is why public service journalism is important. So it's just one of those things that you have to make a part of your daily life, of thinking about your content in a different way and more of a promotional way. I will say that the traits that we've seen of a successful membership organization are the ones who are really willing to embrace the tools and strategies of this and make it part of your culture and your DNA. Editorial needs to buy in. This can't just be a development team program. This can't just be an ad sales program. This really has to be something that the editors and the reporters believe in, because it's about your content and it's about reminding the audience why the content is so important. And once you get somebody to become a member or to support your organization in some way, that's the beginning. That's just the beginning of a meaningful relationship that you hope to have for years to come. Because remember, we want predictable revenue streams. So we want to know they're going to renew. So you have to continuously send premium content to them, find different experiences or access that you can give to them that helps strengthen the relationship over time. Again, I'll come back to the email product. It's the best way to become a part of their routine. If they're waking up once a week with your email in their inbox and they're starting their day with here are the top stories of the week, that's an amazing way to build a relationship. And you need to make sure that you're doing everything you can on your site to collect email addresses. And then social engagement is a big part of it. I know you guys have probably had discussions this week about Facebook and how to maximize your effectiveness. If you can, produce your articles on Instant Articles and add a call to action for an email sign up. We've seen that be very effective, so I think it's worth the work to try to get your articles on Facebook in that way. And just quickly, the keys to success, I mean, orgs without a good email product are going to struggle. I mean, you're going to have a hard time building your email list if you don't have a good email product for people to sign up for. So I think it's worth the time and effort to create at least one solid email product. Constantly focus on audience and list growth. I know that you probably already are, but it is very important to your financial means. It's tough if you don't have a good tech team in-house, or at least a good contractor that you can turn to. So that is a relationship that I think a lot of us put on the back burner that we've come to find. Orgs without it do quickly stall. So if you can make that investment, it's worth it. And I'll just say all those again. And if you have questions, let me know. So right now, the News Revenue Hub is just in its pilot phase, but we've published a lot of online toolkits. We're helping organizations ramp up their capacity building for Newsmatch. We've done a lot of free webinars. We really are here to help. And so if you reach out to us, we're happy to point you in the direction for a lot of online tools, kits that are free and easy to use. So thanks.
Thank you. So we've got time for some questions. And I've got one. What constitutes a good email product? You just talked about that, but what are the fundamental elements of what distinguishes, not so much editorial content being good or bad, but
right.
How do you take a good piece of journalism and turn it into a good email?
Right. So one of the things that we're really finding that a really solid email product is that it's a standalone piece, right? It's not just a headline link back to your site. It's something that really serves as a standalone product so that someone can read it for 5 minutes and feel like they have a solid understanding of your week's top stories or the top stories for the day. It can still link back to your stories, but if it's just a headline link, it's really more of an RSS feed. The most popular email products can be read in 5 minutes and stand alone on its own merits.
So would that have to be the entire story or just
It
a
would.
nice chunk of the story?
A compilation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mary, thank you so much for being here and presenting this. This is something that I really want to do, but I can just never find the time. And I know it's really important. I do it in a very piecemeal, haphazard, not organized way. And I'll admit that up front. Is there any organization out there that would just take this over for me and do it? Because I would pay a lot.
That's the news
I
revenue.
mean, relatively.
That's what we do, actually.
So how do I sign up?
I know. I was afraid that question would come up. No, that's what we do, and that's what our goal is. I mean, we're young, and we're getting funding ourselves, and we would like to turn 16 organizations into 50 or 100 organizations. We would love to be serving all of the INN folks and all the Lion folks. And so I think that's what we're working towards. My goal for you right now in this interim is just to be able to share with you how to kind of change the culture and at least start the beginnings of building your email list, because that's what it's all about. If you have 10,000 email subscribers, that's the threshold for joining the News Revenue Hub, because if you only have 2,000 subscribers, you're going to quickly saturate them, right? And you're going to convert maybe 10% of them. But you have to constantly be adding to that list. So my best advice to all of you right now is think about one email product that you can make, some great email lead acquisition features on your site to get people to sign up, and then start building that product. And that's the first step that you can take.
Do you have any advice for for-profits? Because I know a lot of the language works the best for a nonprofit model, but for those
Great
of us who
question.
would like to use this for-profit?
You know what, we have seen, I was really concerned about that as we started. PolitiFact was our first for-profit client, and we decided to address that elephant right out of the gate. We said, PolitiFact is rolling out a membership program. We're a for-profit arm of the Tampa Bay Times. And as you may know, journalism has to fight and scrape for every dollar in its budget. And we want to keep our budget at PolitiFact free and independent from the Tampa Bay Times, so we need your support, and boom, people got it. So I think you just have to address the landscape of journalism is not what it was. We don't get by on ads and classifieds anymore, so we need readers to support us. And the one thing that I will share that I think is just amazing is one of our clients, Honolulu Civil Beat, was a for-profit site up until last June. They had a paywall, and you had to subscribe to get access to it. And they were a fairly successful example of a paywall news organization, but it just didn't feel right to them. They really felt that they wanted their access free and available to as many people in the Hawaiian Islands as possible. So they changed over to a nonprofit. They opened everything up to everyone, and they said, instead of charging you to receive this content, we're going to ask you to actually just voluntarily contribute what you think it's worth. And their donations went up by 70%. Their average gift more than doubled. Because when you ask somebody to pay what you think the service is worth, and you're transparent and vulnerable about the fact that this might not succeed without their support, all of a sudden you start to see what people really think of you and how much they value the service you provide. And I really don't think it matters if you're a for-profit or a nonprofit. We're all nonprofits. Thank you.
How does your service compare to services like Constant Contact?
So Constant Contact is a tool, right? So one of the things that we had to do when we were putting our tech system together was we had to choose the tools that we needed to make this strategy work. We needed a database management system, so we chose Salesforce. We needed an email service provider. We started with Constant Contact. We pushed it to the outer limits of what it was able to do, and then we switched over to MailChimp, and we found that it was much more well-suited for the automation that we were looking for. And then we chose, after many experimentations with different donation processors, we landed on Stripe. And then what we did was create custom connectors to make all of those off-the-shelf, readily available software apps talk to one another. So just to give you an example of how that looks, if someone comes to your site and subscribes to one of your newsletters, they're automatically, through our connector, pushed from MailChimp into Salesforce, where it's then either reconciled within an existing donor. If that person's already a member, it says, check, now they're getting this newsletter. If not, it creates a new account for them, and they go in the potential member bucket. And then their email is pushed back to MailChimp, and it triggers the beginning of an automated drip campaign that begins to have a conversation with them about supporting the organization.
Mary, Dennis Spellman from Covering Katy News. You mentioned 10,000 subscribers. Is that really the baseline, or if you have fewer than that, can you still make an impact?
You can make an impact. That, for us, is just where we ask that our clients be in order to be eligible for the hub, because we're charging for this service, and we want you to reap the benefits of it. So I think whatever your newsletter subscriber list is right now, it should be more next month. And the month after that, it needs to be more than it was the month prior. Like, you cannot rest on your laurels there. It needs to be trending up every single month, like by the hundreds.
And how much churn do you see? How much drop off do you see that you need to keep making up for every month?
Yeah, I mean, you definitely see drop off. And I think actually the drip campaign really helps people understand, like, okay, this is more than just getting an email every now and then. Like, this is a deeper relationship. And so the folks who stay in are really true value people. I mean, we have a very low opt-out rate in terms of people who opt out because they're getting too much marketing. But yeah, I mean, you'll see churn, a typical churn rate, just of people who didn't really mean to sign up for anything or got thrown in a list accidentally because they came to an event that their friend brought them to. So yeah, I don't have a number in terms of an average percentage.
Anybody else? All right.
So one of the things that I had a question about is how do we get the Gmail piece of this to avoid that whole when in MailChimp, if you throw out a list, it gets caught in that promotions box rather than the regular email.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have like a workaround for that?
Yeah, I mean, these are people who've signed up for something, right? So if they're really an authentic, they've confirmed their subscription when they sign into MailChimp, so that keeps them off that list. And then we're also really careful and put a very high standard on how this content is distributed. It's not spammy, it's not super promotional, it's always tied into editorial content. So there has to be an editorial value to every message that goes out in addition to having a pitch assigned to it. So that has not been an issue, unless you're like buying a list that's not authentic, and we don't advocate for that.
Hey, Mary, thanks for being here. Can you talk about your pricing model for for-profits and how that works, you know, knowing that we're all, I know you love us and you're going to be kind to us with pricing. No,
yeah. So again, this is the pilot phase right now. So we took on 15 organizations in 1 year. And we saw across the board that there's always going to be a big spike when the low-hanging fruit, the people who love you, are asked to donate, they're going to give. And now really what we want to look at next year is what happens in year 2, and how do we build that audience and build that list. So right now, most of our operations are funded by foundation support. So we're charging $15,000 to onboard a new client and $500 a month. And again, we're going through strategic planning ourselves to see how many clients we can afford to bring on. We have 3 full-time employees managing 16 news organizations. So we have to scale ourselves and figure out how to serve the market. But it is absolutely our goal and our hope to have tiered service for really super small orgs and larger tiered, more full service for the larger organizations. So bear with me.
So you're not really ready for us nonprofits to work with you yet? Is that?
The smaller ones, I mean, if you have a list of 10,000, then that's the threshold.
Okay.
Mary, this is Leslie David with Bonita Link. We looked into Salesforce and we felt it was just too big for us.
Mm-hmm.
Have you come across anything that's a step down but is still a very good product?
We're big fans of Salesforce, and Salesforce is very customizable. I mean, I don't think that there's an organization that's too small for it. And I think ultimately, if you're moving towards really dedicating yourself to membership, you're going to want Salesforce. And just we can help you customize it for your scale.
Maria?
Somebody at the Tech Stack session had a free recommendation on that, right? No? It's not free, but it's not very expensive.
Well, if you're a nonprofit, Salesforce, the Salesforce starter pack is free.
But you had did you have another CRM that you guys use? Just wanted to push. Yeah, I'm going to pass this down there so you can say it and everybody can hear. But I thought that was interesting to
Yeah, for profits, Salesforce can be expensive once you get beyond a few people. It's not terrible if you have one account, but
Yeah, I mean,
if
it's
you've got a
based on the
team, it
number
can be
of
a little
licenses
pricey.
and the number of users.
So Pipedrive is what we use for
Pipedrive,
the record.
everyone.
Anyone else? David.
Thank you. My question is, do you offer individual one-time services or consultation for a price, and what might some of those be?
We haven't really put a price on it yet. We've been commissioned by Knight and Democracy Fund to help the broader INN base build capacity for Newsmatch. And so we've been doing a lot of one-on-one coaching and additional webinars. So we're still happy to do that between now and the end of the year as part of that service. So you guys are honestly welcome to reach out, email us. We're happy to schedule a call, walk through any of the things that you can be doing between now and the end of the year to have a successful year-end campaign. And you know, we can even send you an online toolkit that has a lot of really good information on things that you can be doing.
It may be a tough question. What's the return on investment ratio?
So, I mean, it differs. I mean, our smallest org has brought in 88,000, and they're paying 500 a month. So it they didn't. Yeah, this was their pilot org. Yeah, so they were sponsored, but yeah, you pay 15,000 to get in, and it's $500 a month. It's obviously not market value of what you would pay a consulting firm. This is, you know, a nonprofit that's being funded primarily by foundation support. So if we become self-sustaining at some point, we'll have to ramp up our prices to be either a percentage of the revenue that the organizations are bringing in. So that's something that we're all working out at the same time too.
Anyone else? Thank you very much, Mary.
Yeah, thanks.
And up next, I believe we got a representative from City Bureau. If they're in the room. Maybe side and outside. There. You coming? All right. Sorry to catch you off guard. That's what happens when you start changing the schedule around. Yeah, Jesse, you're up. Jesse Holcomb is not from City Bureau. Jesse's a pretty frequent flyer at Lion conferences, although I think his presentation this time around is going to be a little bit different because he's wearing a slightly, his hat is cocked at a slightly different angle these days, right?
That's correct. Well, I'll take this time to introduce myself to those of you. Is this on? Okay. This is better. Okay. So I know a fair amount of you have been coming to these things for a while, so thanks for having me back, Dylan and friends. So I spent the last 10 years at the Pew Research Center in the news, media, and journalism division, where I was I was associate director, helping to lead research on the broad landscape of news and journalism. I am now faculty at Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where I'm teaching journalism communication there as well. I'm a Tao Fellow, Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University. So what I want to do here, if we can get the slides up eventually, is what I've typically done is shared some of the highlights of the Pew Research Center data that is most relevant to anyone in your sort of publishing space. So I'm going to do a little bit of that today. But at the same time, what I also want to do is serve as something of a clearinghouse. There's a lot of research that comes out of academic environments. Some of it's gated behind a paywall. think tanks, philanthropies, other organizations, in addition to the Pew Research Center, that are producing research and data that are useful to you. I've tried to compile what I see as some of the real highlights of that in one place to hopefully make it easier for you to kind of sort through all of the information that's out there, and to try to tell a really brief, succinct story of what we see using data about trends in digital local journalism. So that's what I'm doing here today. If I missed something, which I know I have, please let me know. I'll add it to the slide deck, and hopefully that can serve as an ongoing resource for you. But since I've been coming from the Pew Research Center, I have to start with a few Pew numbers here. And here are some of the big hits that are important to revisit. And the first one is that social media is still, of course, a huge entry point for news consumption. A lot of it passive news consumption, though, okay? Notice that as of 2017, only about 1 in 5 American adults get news often on social media sites, but a majority of American adults get at least some. And of course, Facebook here is the giant in the room when it comes to access to any kind of news on social platforms. One thing I've been noticing through some of the research lately is that national news interest is sort of having a moment here for a lot of probably obvious reasons. And it seems to be in some ways dominating platforms according to some focus groups and interviews with news consumers around the country. Nevertheless, audiences are recognizing the importance of local news too. So if you look at this second quote from Tao Center focus group, someone says, "I'm the worst at keeping up with local news as well as I do with national news. It's really hard to do with local news, and none of my Facebook friends share local news on Facebook. It's all national based." At least this is sort of a momentary kind of sentiment. But another commentator says, you kind of realize that the local stuff is what's actually important and affecting you more than what you see on CNN. So people recognize that. Aside from social, of course, mobile is the other huge mega trend in terms of tech access to any kind of news. As of this year, 85% of US adults are getting at least some news from a mobile device. So it's reaching just like total market share here. Some other key local news numbers, again from some Pew data here. About a third of people say they follow local news very closely. However, a ton of people follow local news at least a little bit or passively. About 30% follow neighborhood news closely. About a quarter say that their local media do a good job. About a quarter say they trust the info from local news organizations a lot. All right, are you getting kind of the picture here? 25%, 30, 35%. To me, and I haven't gone and looked internally at the data, but I'm guessing there's a lot of overlap between these groups. There is sort of a core, yes? Yeah, sure. Well, that's what I'm saying. You certainly see it, and I'll get to this in a moment. The people who are highly civically engaged are also more likely to really trust their local media. They're also more likely to consume their local media. So what I'm saying is that these trends move together, and that I haven't gone deep into these data points, but I'm willing to bet you there's a lot of overlap between these different groups. Okay, so there is this core contingent that is highly engaged, highly trusting, and highly interested. Another area where I think we're probably going to see some more research, but haven't seen a ton of it yet, is this idea of misinformation and distrust coming to a town near you. I'm not sure if you saw this story in the New York Times come out of this small Idaho city, but if you're talking to local editors, and in fact I heard this surfacing in a recent editorial convention, newspaper publishers, at very least from what I was hearing, asked, are you getting labeled and thrown that fake news accusation? Yes, 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 yes. So some of these sort of ugly issues that are very polarizing on a national level, we're going to have to deal with them in local communities too, and at the local level. And this is one area where I'm looking forward to seeing and hoping to see a lot more actionable research on the local level. But field group, and I'm turning back to some good solid Tao Center field work here, offers some ways forward. So common threads coming out of this research. explore local issues and local angles on national issues with the solutions journalism approach. I think a term that's probably surfaced here a number of times. Collaboration with outlets that residents are already reading, watching, and listening to is really important toward providing a bulwark against some of these corrosive community issues. Providing opportunities for community engagement and participatory journalism, again, can really sort of counteract some of these polarizing tides. I was mentioning, Dylan, about the civic engagement data, all right? We know from research from the last year that the civically engaged are more likely to use local digital news. And this is kind of one of those virtuous circles. The more civic engagement we see in local communities, the more they are going to invest in and consume and engage with local news. And this is, yes, true of local, what we used in our survey element or instrument, local newsletters, listservs, local blogs. There are research reasons why you use these terms, but again, what they indicate is that, of course, you have more exposure to the local broadcast organization, but where you really see some growth in civic engagement are some of these more civic-oriented publishers. We're really going to attract a civically engaged core of the public. And in turn, engagement with that content can stimulate and promote some engagement in the community as well. I'm going to cover in one slide some of the relevant research about local journalism economics, which used to be done in probably 1,000 pages of the State of the News Media report. So here it's in one slide. But you see, just to remind any of you who aren't aware of all this already, seeing some continued pretty dramatic declines in the print advertising scene. That's the upper left-hand tile. This is daily newspapers. On the right upper hand side, you see the broadcast picture, okay? And my worried face is obscuring the words TV. But here you see some audience decline in local broadcast, yet the ad outlook's still okay for the short term, but I still think we're looking at some pretty high chances of some disruption in the local broadcast picture over the coming years. Public media on the lower left, if you look at the Pew Research Center's fact sheet there, you see nothing but up, up, up. Increases in revenue, increases in membership, increases in different kinds of revenue, earned and otherwise. Really sort of a strong foundation if you're sort of panning back and looking at the whole local media situation. But there on the lower right, this is, yes, sir. Sorry, good question. What I'm talking about are local stations here. So local radio stations, public broadcasters that a lot of this work was looking at the top 125 local public broadcasters radio-wise in the United States. So that 125 markets, we looked at some data on their revenue streams, on their number of members they have, a detailed breakdown of their revenue streams, and it was a pretty clear picture of stability and in many cases growing strength. I also include some data showing some struggles among Hispanic-oriented community weekly newspapers in that lower right-hand corner. Again, not necessarily what I'm saying is a proxy for interest or engagement, but again, there's some business concerns in that particular segment of the market. Consolidation is politicizing the airwaves, okay, and thinning community coverage on the print side, all right? You've all heard about what's happening perhaps with Sinclair Broadcast Group, making this overture toward Tribune. On the print side, and this is work that Penny Abernathy at UNC has detailed really nicely. 3 largest companies used to own about 500 newspapers with a combined circulation of 10 million. Today, that's gone to about 900 papers and a combined circulation of nearly 13 million, right? Today, we have 600 fewer newspapers, almost 900 fewer owners than in 2004, right? Now, on the local online publisher situation, again, this is data that you've seen. You all know Michelle McClellan, I hope. But what I want to include here is just some references to some highlights of work that she published last year, which I think is the most recent data available. I know she's working on some more research. But what you see here is basically a slide showing that there are fewer local online publishers today than there were in the previous year who are generating less than 100,000 a year or less than 50,000 a year. That's kind of a backwards way of looking at it, but it does point to some increased stability in the local online publishing scene when it comes to bottom line. A few other highlights here. 84% of publishers, she's surveying, again, a mixture of for-profit and nonprofit local publishers, a cohort of between 1 and 150, I believe. Vast majority say advertising accounts for at least half of revenue. And I noticed, this was kind of interesting, that only about 10% of publishers that sell ads are doing so with video. All right, so that's probably a proxy for the this whole pivot to video kind of conversation that may or may not be touching the local market. Nearly half of these publishers say they've got full-time paid staff. 3/4, make of this what you will, publishers draw a salary. I think there are signs that the Overton window is moving when it comes to willingness to pay for news. This is news of any kind. This is research coming out of places like the Reuters Institute, looking at European media markets, American Press Institute looking domestically. Young audiences are more likely to subscribe to a news product based on affinity for the publisher's mission, okay? So the connection with what the publisher is doing is going to drive up that willingness to pay. And younger adults are much more likely, incidentally, than older adults to consider themselves digital subscribers, right? That is their primary access point when it comes to developing a paid relationship with a news organization. I'm going to take a quick turn to questions of access to local journalistic information, because that's an important part of this puzzle too, right? And what I'll say here is that one thing we think we know is that access to local news is distributed unevenly, and this is based on work coming out of the News Measures Research Project. Phil Napoli and other colleagues out of Duke University and elsewhere, basically finding that when you control for all kinds of demographic factors, there are some states that basically have more journalists per capita than others. But trying to find some meaning in this data and the why and the how of it is still kind of a question that researchers really need to be exploring. What this map is really telling you, I think, is that the Southeast has some of the bigger disparities consistently across that region. That is one thing that we think we know. Some of these states that are in red suggest a big disparity between the amount of local journalists and the population, but we don't understand why yet, okay? So it's perhaps a state like New Jersey or Maryland are very close to a huge media market that's just over a state line. That might be contributing to the issue, but I think there's some probably, and I think the researchers here would admit as well, there's some things we don't understand about this data, but I do think that southeastern region is one where I think a clearer picture is emerging of some challenges and, of course, opportunities. The research from many different quadrants over the last year is pointing again to a future of local journalism that is collaborative, okay? Some scholarship coming out of the academy is finding in looking at various case studies of local publishers that there are really 3 characteristics predicting long-term viability of a local, civically oriented journalism startup. Being networked, belonging to partnerships with other organizations, all right? Being planted and rooted in an entrepreneurial community really helps as well. And finally, affiliation with a college or university, and that's a point that Gray, Beal, and Syndic in this lower bullet point here echo in their research as well, is that attachment to bigger academic institutions can actually help in terms of some long-term sustainability, though of course we know that that comes with some headaches and challenges as well. And I know that you've heard some of the great work coming out of the Center for Cooperative Media, Montclair State, but again, what's really exciting to me is that some clear models of collaboration are starting to emerge thanks to some research that are clustering these in different kinds of helpful quadrants. So we can see some patterns that fit and recognize that there isn't a one-size-fits-all kind of approach to all this. So my quick takeaways here from everything I've shared with you, which cover some highlights across many different institutions, organizations, and academics over the past year. The macro tech usage trends of mobile and social media are not going away. In some cases, they're accelerating. so is the need to optimize for those. So responsive design. I see a lot of local digital publishers that don't have a responsive design designed for mobile for their website. Not everyone is as obsessed with local news or as engaged in the community as you are. That does not mean that there's not a widespread, at least passive interest in local news. But there is a core group. Expanding reach and trust is a one relationship at a time prospect for many communities. Right? The twin trends of politicization of local news, right? I was talking about Sinclair, and consolidation of ownership creates an even bigger opportunity for independent media to fill a really, really important void here. Finally, there seems to really be a consensus emerging that about the perils of going it alone. Networks, right, are increasingly important for success and sustainability. So that is all I wanted to share with you. Happy to make this stuff public, and I'd be happy to add to this slide deck if you're out there saying you really missed something important. I didn't include Damian's stuff here, of course, which is hugely vital to this field because he's going to talk about it.
We've got time for a few quick questions. One maybe question, observation. When you're talking about that continuing reach of the conglomerates, since that data was current, that was 2016, we've seen even more newspapers, radio stations, TV stations sucked into the maw of conglomerates. So that figure's got to be even way higher now.
Oh yeah, I think so. And you know, this stuff does take time to pull together. So, but when you see one of these mega trends,
the trend is clear.
Oh yeah, the trend is clear. When you see this stuff happening at such a dramatic rate over a 10-year period that ended in say 2012, 14, or 15, you know, you can kind of predict what you're going to see in 2018, 19, and 20.
So that does create, as you were saying, that space for us as indie publishers who are doing a dramatically different job.
Yeah, I think so. And the pitch there is, you know, when I was a college student, going local, and you know, the idea of supporting local businesses, local coffee roasters, you know, local this, local that was really. A lot of people latched onto that back in the aughts. You know, I don't see why now is not the time to really sort of like really pull from that whole sort of ethos and that whole movement in terms of how we talk about local community-driven journalism.
What kind of relationships have you seen with colleges that were fruitful? I mean, I get the Center for Cooperative Media, but what other ones have you seen? And what was the relationship like? Like, I mean, I literally have 9 universities in Nashville. Right. Like, what could I be doing to reach out to them to have a better relationship other than hiring their interns?
Yeah, well, you know, this is digging back to some of the work I did, mostly focused on the nonprofit space. So this is perhaps not as sort of directly translatable to the for-profit space. But back in 2012, 2013, what I was seeing was about a quarter of all digital nonprofit publishers, I think that's what the number was, a quarter to a third that were basically in some ways formally attached to a college or university, and that was through either a sort of a fiscal sponsorship model, they didn't have their 501c3, or perhaps a brick and mortar model, so they had office space there, which gets kind of tricky and political with, say, you know, land-grant universities and such, or it was you know, another sort of more formal institutional model, teaching hospital kind of model, where a newsroom with students was embedded in the university. So the different kinds of models, and again, I'm not going to say they don't come without their headaches and with their politics, but you know, that's what I've generally seen, you know, the way it kind of shakes out.
Anyone else?
Sure, it's not necessarily a question, but the graphic that said, you know, 25 to 33% of people trust their local, like local and trust local, which means sort of like 70 to 75% of people. Does that mean that they don't have any interest in local, or they don't?
No.
And are these numbers up or down? I mean,
like, yeah,
is it a growing number? And so then how do we penetrate the 75 to 67% of people who are not following local news closely or who don't trust? Like, that's a big, I mean, those numbers are interesting, but there's the small side means there's way more people out there that we need to capture aggressively or something? Or is it because they don't trust the legacy local media? It's not us, it's them. And so,
Yeah, those are really, really great
that
questions.
in my mind.
Very good question. So, right. So these are people who are really pretty hardcore enthusiastic about their local media. What it masks is perhaps, I'm thinking, another 40, 50% who are not, antagonistic to local news. You'll see other kinds of data that show people are more interested in local community information than many, many other topics when you ask sort of topically. When you ask, do you follow local news, national news, international news very closely, you'll find, generally speaking, people are more interested in what's happening in their backyard, okay, than they are in, say, international affairs. So those numbers are higher. What we have seen over the past year in the data is a slight downtick, a very slight downtick, to the point of perhaps not even being statistically significant, in the share of public saying they're very interested in local news. A slight uptick, and again, I'm not sure that it's statistically significant, in the share of public interested in national news. Okay, I think we can imagine why that is. And I don't see that as a structural change. It's a little bit of, maybe a little bit of, a little ripple in the data. But I don't see anything to indicate that there's some sort of long-term wane of interest or demand for local news. Perhaps to the contrary, people really value their local information. There's other research that finds that when you ask people about their media, okay, the media they consume, much higher levels of trust. When you ask about specific brands and specific outlets, you're going to see an increase in people who connect with that. So there are limits to these kinds of data points, to be sure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The thing I always find interesting about your presentations is they aren't just a big stack of numbers. They really point to some of the challenges that we have, and also some of those opportunities. Like, how do we make it very clear that we are different than the Borg of conglomerated media?
Right. No, and hopefully some of those are a little bit more clear to you when you start to see patterns in multiple organizations, institutions, and scholars who are starting to point in the same direction.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
And somewhat in the same vein, our next presenter is going to talk about the state of local newspapers. Where's Damian at? There he is.
How are you all doing? It's Saturday afternoon on day 3. Yeah. Okay, good. That's great. Whilst this is just being pulled up, I'm actually going to share with you something that I wasn't going to talk about. So as you can probably tell from my accent and my teeth, I'm not from around here. I'm British originally, and I moved to the US in 2015 to go and teach journalism at the University of Oregon. And prior to that, I spent 20 years in industry, a large part of it in local media, including doing a lot of research work on the UK hyperlocal media scene. And I looked kind of from the other side of the pond at what was happening with Lion, and was incredibly impressed by it. And back in 2012, I wrote the first landscape report of the UK hyperlocal media scene, and I wrote a follow-up in 2015. Now you can hear me. And one of the things that I advocated through that work was that the UK needed its own version of Lion. And I'm pleased to say that in July this year, they got it. Yeah.
Next year, England.
That's right. The ICNN Independent Community News Network, which is supported by the Centre for Community Journalism in Cardiff. It launched in July. It's already representing a whole range of different members, giving the sector a voice to funders and to policymakers in a way that wasn't previously possible. So thank you all for the inspiration and for helping to create that idea, and I'll share with you some links about that once I finish talking this afternoon. So that's a kind of an aside. What I want to talk about today is some of the research work that I've been doing here in the US over the course of the last year, I've been involved in 3 research projects, 2 of which are already in the public domain, the other one of which is coming out in a couple of weeks' time, all really kind of looking at the plight of local newspapers, and in particular small market local newspapers, which my friend and co-researcher Christopher Alley and I defined as publications with a circulation of 50,000 or less. And there's huge variety and disparity within that sector, but that was the definition that we came up with. And we really sought to address 3 kind of key questions. We wanted to try and get a sense of what's happening in this marketplace. How are small market newspapers responding to the opportunities and the challenges presented by digital disruption? What are they doing to prepare themselves for the future? Can we identify such things as best practice? And also for me, I also wanted to get a bit more of a sense of what was going on in my new home, what's happening here in the US, both kind of across the whole of the country, and also then within the Pacific Northwest, which was a project that I did over the course of the summer and published a couple of weeks ago. And the kind of 10 outlets featured there really serve as a microcosm for what's happening across the wider industry. And this kind of mattered to me for a variety of reasons, not least of which is the fact that I now work in a university after 20 years in industry, and for so many of the students, when they graduate, local newspapers, local shops, that's where they go to work. So understanding that landscape is incredibly important to inform the work that we do in the classroom, to equip our students with the skills and attitudes that they need to go and do great work at local newspapers. I was also very conscious of the fact that there hadn't really been a large nationwide study kind of looking at newspapers since 2011. Some of you may remember the Waldman report, the big FCC study, which took a huge look at what was happening across local. Since then, we've seen fantastic research on very specific verticals. So like Jesse mentioned Michelle McClellan's work, for example, on hyperlocals. We've had fantastic work supported by the Dodge Foundation looking at various different things in New Jersey, but we haven't really kind of touched base with what's happening across the whole of the US. And I also felt when I started doing this work last summer, so summer 2016, there wasn't enough noise being made about the importance of local and local journalism. And particularly in an election year, I felt that that was very significant, and I'm glad to see that since I started doing this work, there's been a bit of a sea change there, and we're now starting to get more coverage about what's happening in the local space. So what did I find from this research? Well, really there were 3 kind of big themes that emerged, and this is like a précis of about 65,000 words worth of research across 3 reports. The first thing to say is that despite all the kind of changes and challenges that the industry has been through over the course of the past few decades, there was a lot more optimism than one might expect. And I'll come back and explain why. But that's surprising because we've seen 20,000 journalists' jobs lost over the course of the past 2 decades. Jesse's just shown you how many titles have changed and shuttered, and we also know that many titles that are still around are not necessarily the size that they once were. They might publish less frequently. They might take more content from wire services. They're doing more with less. At the same time, we also found experimentation and innovation happening on both the business and the content side. And very quickly, when I was having conversations with journalists and with publishers, it became abundantly clear that actually we need to start talking about the industry in a different way. We need to frame our conversation differently. Because what we tend to do is talk about the newspaper industry as if it was one single homogeneous entity. And it's not. It's a product of many, many different types of experiences. Most of the data that we have great data from Pew and from a range of other places, but typically it's aggregated data when we talk about newspapers. So we don't know enough about what's happening at, say, family-owned publications versus those that are part of a large chain like Gannett, or if you're owned by an investment company. What's the difference between those that are in rural or urban environments, if you're daily versus weekly, and so forth. We need to unpack all of that data and analysis to realize there are many different narratives here. And we can't just talk about the industry as if it was one single homogeneous entity. In terms of the optimism that I touched on, it's interesting that in many cases, a lot of publications are seeing a resilience in terms of their circulation. Pew's data are actually shown over the course of the last decade, circulation has held steady or grown. But of course, that's offset by dramatic, often 5% or more losses year on year in terms of advertising revenue. And that increase in circulation does not make up for the ad shortfall. But people are still buying newspapers, and it's important to remember that. Similarly, when it comes to local organizations, I believe that the proximity and closeness of the relationship that they have to the community that they're reporting on is a tremendous asset. I think actually the future is much more rosy if you're a local paper than if you're a metro, or I think it's much harder to define what your identity is in this day and age. And I think we also shouldn't overlook the value of the kind of brand and heritage and reputation that many organizations have within their community. And yes, we know that the conversation is starting to change and shift to distrust in the media, references to fake news as labels that are being thrown at all publishers. But I think at the same time, many news organizations have been around for a very, very long time in their community, and that brings with it a trust and a relationship that perhaps is often underestimated. In the innovation and experimentation space, I mentioned that we're seeing this on both the business and also the content side, and I'm going to just talk through some examples of that. And it's also being underpinned by some shifts in attitude that we're also seeing from some publishers, editors, and journalists. So everyone always wants to talk about money, so let's talk about money. I want to highlight 8 particular revenue examples that I think are worth highlighting. The first is paywalls and subscriptions. What's surprising for me when I was kind of looking back into this was to realize just how quickly paywalls have become an established part of our media diet and the way in which business models tend to be run. So it was back in 2012, so only 5 years ago, that Gannett, Lee, McClatchy, and Scripps rolled out paywalls with Digital First rolling out in 2013. So that's less than 5 years ago. And yet it's already become an established way in which organizations make money. What's interesting in this space, though, I think, is to see that there's a lot of experimentation happening in that space. So paywalls are not set in stone. Organizations are constantly playing around with what's the point of entry. If you've got a metered model, how many articles do you allow for free? Can you have certain verticals that are outside of your paywall versus ones that are inside? We particularly see that around things like entertainment, sports, job listings, verticals where perhaps it's easier to sell ad inventory, and therefore you might offer that content for free, or where that content arguably has very strong public service sensibilities, and there's a wariness about putting that behind a paywall. I think there's also interesting experiments going on around with things like IP flexibility. So the Dallas Morning News, you have a different paywall if you are out of market versus if you are in market, because they're much more interested in reaching a local audience, so you very quickly hit that paywall if you're outside of an IP address that's beyond Dallas-Fort Worth versus if you're within it. So we're seeing kind of experimentation in that space. We're seeing more organizations creating spin-off services, creating companies that are doing commercial work, leveraging the skills that are used on a day-to-day basis by newspapers. So creating digital content, creating other assets such as apps and websites, and of course, printing the content using their own printing presses for other publishers. And that's a handy source of revenue. And then in terms of other ideas, many of these are not new. I mean, it's interesting to see the renaissance that we're seeing with podcasting and with newsletters. Google surveys feel as if they're kind of making a bit of a comeback. You can't access content until you choose to answer a few questions. But also some shifting attitudes towards things like obits. How many of you have obituaries on your site? So most of you, okay. And then how many of you charge for obits? A few of you. Okay, and how many of you didn't used to but you now do? Okay, a few, right. So there's a good example of something that is proving to be a handy revenue source for many small newspapers and didn't used to be a source that they tapped into. Yeah, okay. Great. That's fantastic. Great. So I think that's an interesting example of taking a subject area that is perhaps not that obvious, not that sexy or glamorous, but actually is a potential revenue source for many organizations. I'm going to touch on a little bit about, I don't know how you would make death sexy, by the way. There we go. Anyway, talking about changing journalistic practice. At the end of last year, we did a survey of local journalists working at small market newspapers. 420 of them from across the US responded. And this was important because it gave us a chance to get a sense of what's really happening at the coalface too often a lot of these conversations are focused on interviews with editors and publishers, and yes, I did that as well, but I also wanted to get the perspective from people who were working in the newsroom, gave them the opportunity to contribute their experiences with complete anonymity to talk about what it's like to work on a local newspaper and how it has changed. And one of the most obvious and kind of profound changes was a recognition of the fact that they're just spending a lot more time on digital than they were 2 or 3 years ago. So 70% of the journalists who responded said we now spend more time on digital, and nearly half said their individual story load has increased over the course of the past 2 years. So we know that newsrooms are smaller, and they're also under increasing pressure now to produce more stories and to squirt it out for more platforms. And yet that relationship with digital is an uncomfortable and an uneasy one. We found some publishers deliberately ignored certain platforms, as one publisher notably said, likes do not equal dollars. And that's very true. You know, you might well look at engagement or interaction that you're getting with a post on Facebook or Instagram, but it doesn't necessarily translate to hard cash. So there's an interesting question and kind of philosophy that's kind of being explored in a number of different newsrooms to say, do you go to where the audience is and hope that they might come back to you? You can't afford to not engage with them. Or do you go on these platforms and hope you'll work out what the business strategy is at a later point? And no one knows the answers to these questions, and they're being debated on a daily basis. That feeds into the rise and emergence of engagement that we're starting to see really in all newsrooms. And engagement is a term that means many different things to different people. For some, it's just about some of the kind of hard stats, like measuring time on site and your users and subscribers and so forth. But for others, it's more of a philosophical approach, about getting out of the newsroom, about walking away from air-conditioned journalism to actually interact with your audience and engage with them, find out what are the issues that really matter to them, using them as a resource to help shape and inform the coverage and the stories that you are telling. And that's a shift for many newsrooms, and one that organizations are still, in some extent, kind of grappling with understanding, how do we make this work? Again, what are the ROIs here, and how do I do this when I'm already under so much pressure to do my kind of traditional job? This is just another thing I have to do, but arguably it leads to better reporting, better relationships with your audience and your community, and that can translate into a stronger bottom financial line. And so engagement and kind of questions around that are part of wider philosophical shifts that organizations are exploring. Unprompted, a lot of editors and journalists started talking about whether previous attitudes they'd had around objectivity, around distance from the community, were they still valid in this day and age? What was the role of a local newspaper in terms of being an advocate for the community? And should they be doing advocacy work? Should they be exploring more of a solutions journalism approach? That's not advocacy, but it is a different way of reflecting and telling stories. And how do you deepen that relationship with the community, recognizing that most journalists, they live and work in the community that they're reporting from. And so that's a very different dynamic to if you're at a regional or a national title. So what does this all mean for you? Well, I want to touch on kind of 5 key considerations. The first is to say, and this might kind of seem like an obvious point, but that journalism, and in particular local journalism of the future, will not be the same as it was in the past. And I think that's an important point to make, because too often a lot of conversations are steeped in how things used to be, how they were, a desire to turn back the clock to an age that has been and gone. So we have to understand that where we are now is not where we're going to be in a couple of years' time, and we have to move forward in terms of what we do and how we do it. I believe that for small market newspapers, the single most thing that they should really be focusing their energies on is original reporting. We live in an age where we have access to more information than ever, and we're no longer in a news-scarce environment. But we all know there are certain stories and beats and communities that are not well covered. So focusing on that, focusing on producing unique content that is not replicated elsewhere, I think gives you the best possible chance of then creating an environment and a framework where you can create a business model where people will pay for your content. And that's going to mean doing some things differently. It's going to mean being more selective. Jim Brady, when I spoke to him, had this great phrase. He said, you can do anything, but you can't do everything. I think that's a fair reflection of most newsrooms now. And everybody I spoke to, I asked them, what's happened to your newsroom over the course of the last 2 or 3 years? Has it stayed the same size? Has it grown? No. Everybody said their newsroom had shrunk. So the follow-up question was then always, okay, so what do you not do now you have less resources? And in most cases, everyone said, well, we're trying to do the same things as we've always done. And that's not a sustainable way to operate your business. With fewer resources, you're going to have to do fewer things. And that may mean cutting certain beats. It might mean just doing some kind of existing things differently, so moving to wire copy for certain beats that you might have done yourself. Asking questions like, why are we using a GA to rewrite wire copy when we don't have enough GAs to cover original stories and original reporting that we want to do? And it also means trying to understand what are the real kind of passion points, the kind of pillars for your community. This was Jan Schaefer's phrase about defining and owning the master narrative of your community, which I loved and happily purloin on a regular basis. Of saying, we need to understand more what are the 3, 4, 5 things that your community really, really cares about. Do that and do that really, really well. And the likelihood is a lot of that stuff won't be being covered elsewhere. So that's where your original reporting can make a difference. On the financial and revenue front, income diversification is absolutely fundamental. Most of the organizations I spoke to still incredibly print heavy. 75 to 80% of their income comes through print, but they know that that is a declining revenue source, even though as a percentage of their overall revenue pie, it often remains around the same. So they need to diversify and try and attract content from different sources. And we've touched on this a number of times. Tracy talked about this morning. We've also had some fantastic conversations about collaborative journalism. There are opportunities to partner on everything from beats to the tech that you have, to selling your ad inventory, working with a range of different local and national organizations across a variety of different sectors. And I firmly believe that partnerships will be fundamental to the success of local media and local journalism in the future. And finally, I wanted to leave you with this point, that we need to change the narrative. We need to change the conversation. This came up in the survey, and it came up in multiple conversations with editors. If we talk about newspapers and we talk about local news and local journalism as a dying industry, then we risk making that a reality. And yet we know from the conversations that we've had over the past couple of days that actually there's an incredibly vibrant local news sector with really interesting and important and innovative work that's taking place. So everyone in this room can help to contribute to this conversation by changing the narrative and reinforcing the importance of local journalism and making it clear that, yes, there are bumps on the road ahead, but we're not dead yet, and we're not going to be for a long, long time to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We do have time for a couple of quick questions, if anybody has some questions or comments.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. Can you talk just a little about the partnerships? You just mentioned it at the end. You said partnerships are going to be essential. What might those look like?
Yeah, sure. So here's a couple of examples. So the one at the top, I think a lot of people in this room will be very familiar about the partnership between Charlottesville Tomorrow and the Daily Progress of sharing content and particular beats in an environment where the old traditional local newspaper had dramatically cut in size, so gone from around 40 reporters to 18 in 2009. And so Charlottesville Tomorrow started to cover a whole range of civic beats like City Hall. I think they're also doing education and a bunch of other beats as well that risked potentially just not being covered by the old print newspaper. And I think one of the things that's great about that partnership is that also that content is credited and it links through to the original source, and it was all done incredibly easily. As I understand it, there was a one-page MOU, no lawyers were involved, they just got on and did it. There are opportunities in working with organizations like the Local Media Consortium, and they have large groups like the McClatchys of this world, but they're also willing to work with smaller publishers to help sell their advertising inventory. So you may well be able to get material from ads from the likes of kind of Honda, Disney, and some of their kind of national brands. And this is an example, goes to one of the points Jesse made about working with academic partners. This is from an augmented reality app from the Herald and News in Klamath Falls in southern Oregon. It's not a big shop. They have about 14 people who work there in total. And a couple of years ago, they had a Babe Ruth baseball summer tournament. And they partnered with the local tech college who wanted to do some AR stuff that they were kind of playing around with in the classroom and said, can we help you take this to your audience? So it was the college who created an app, and they did this rather nice thing where they were able to publish kind of old traditional style baseball cards for the individual players, and if you hovered over it with the app, then it flipped over and you got stats on one side and kind of profile picture on the other. And they've done a whole bunch of different things with this college, including 360-degree videos. At one point, they were punting out one piece of AR content a week in partnership with that. And that's more than most national publications, and they are way, way smaller than that. So just a variety of different organizations that you can partner with. And I think there's a greater willingness to partner, a greater recognition, as we've already heard over the last couple of days, that for journalism to succeed, we're going to have to work with others and can't go it alone. And that's a good thing.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks, Stephen.
I just want to remind everybody that we would like you to vote on the best idea from the not quite 40 ideas in 40 minutes session that we had yesterday morning on the Wine Publishers website in the conference blog, winepublishers.com/conference. You see in the blog a post there where you can cast your vote for the best idea that came out of that session. And the winner of that is going to get a $100 gift card. So you get to dramatically have an effect on someone's life by casting a ballot. We're going to take a very quick 5 minutes top coffee break and come back in here for about 3 more lightning rounds, I believe. So 5 minutes, please.